Hey everyone, tonight we're stepping back in time, not to the grand battlefields or the gilded palaces you might expect, but into the hushed velvety drawing rooms of Elizabethan England. Imagine it's late evening. The fire crackles softly in the hearth, and a single candle casts long, dancing shadows across a massive oak table. A man sits there, a nobleman, but he's not poring over maps of a new territory or writing a sonnet to his beloved. His fingers are stained a faint, sticky brown, and he's meticulously arranging small, crystalline cubes on a silver tray. The air around him is thick with a scent so sweet it's almost intoxicating, a scent that whispers of wealth and power, but also of a strange, quiet madness. You can almost feel the chill from the stone walls creeping in, a stark contrast to the heat of the fire and the feverish intensity of the man's focus. You're about to meet one of the most eccentric figures of his age, a man who, in a time of great upheaval and discovery, found his true passion not in conquest, but in confection. The thing is, if you'd lived back then, you probably wouldn't survive the luxury he indulged in. A simple taste of his hoard could have bankrupted you for life. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. If you're listening in, why not drop your location and the local time in the comments? And if you're a regular, feel free to like and follow the channel to continue waiting for the next exciting parts. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Our story begins with Sir Francis Dashwood, 1st Baronet, a name that, even today, carries a certain weight. You're probably picturing a figure in a ruff and velvet doublet, and you wouldn't be far off. But Dashwood was more than just a well-dressed nobleman. He was a man of extremes, a contradiction wrapped in fine lace. We find him, not yet the notorious figure he would become, but a young man of considerable means. He inherited a title, yes, but more importantly, he inherited a fortune that could make kings blush. This wealth wasn't just a comfortable cushion. It was a launching pad for a life of unprecedented indulgence and intellectual curiosity. It's a mainstream historical fact that for men of his class and time, inherited wealth was the golden ticket to a world of leisure, politics, and power. But while many of his peers were content to hunt foxes and manage their estates, Dashwood was already showing signs of a different kind of ambition, one that didn't fit neatly into the established social order. Imagine a young Francis, perhaps in his late teens, already a keen collector of things, not just the usual paintings and tapestries, but oddities, a taxidermied crocodile from the New World, a set of intricate porcelain bowls from China, a scroll filled with strange geometric patterns he couldn't quite decipher. This early fascination with the rare and the exotic was his first hint of an obsessive personality. His tastes were a quirky or fringe tidbit of his personality that set him apart. He wasn't just buying things. He was acquiring stories, secrets, and a sense of mystique. This desire to possess the unusual, to hold a piece of the world that others couldn't, was a core part of his character. It was as if he was trying to collect not just objects, but experiences. He had an insatiable hunger for the new and the strange, a hunger that his vast fortune allowed him to satisfy with little thought for the cost. This is the moment you first realize that this isn't just a story about a rich man. It's a story about a man trying to fill an unfillable void with things. This early life of privilege and peculiar interests set the stage for everything that was to follow. Historians still argue whether his early obsession with collecting was a sign of genius or a precursor to a deep-seated pathology. Was he a visionary who saw the world differently, or was he a man so insulated by wealth that his eccentricities were allowed to flourish unchecked? We'll never truly know. But the stage is set. We have a young, wealthy nobleman with a growing taste for the extraordinary and a mind that seems to work on a different frequency than those around him. The seeds of his future obsession are being planted, one strange and beautiful artifact at a time. This isn't just about collecting, it's about control. about shaping his world exactly as he saw fit, regardless of convention or common sense. And as we'll soon discover, this desire for control would lead him down a very strange, very sweet path. As you continue your journey, you realize that the story of Francis Dashwood isn't just about the man himself, but about the soil from which he grew. To truly understand his monumental, sugary obsession, you must first understand the foundation of his fortune. The Dashwood family name, to many in London society, was synonymous with vast and almost incomprehensible wealth. It wasn't an ancient, storied name that traced its lineage back to the Norman conquest, a mainstream historical fact you'd find in any textbook. No, the Dashwoods were a relatively newer breed of aristocracy, and their rise was a perfect example of how the new world of commerce and finance could create power faster than old world lineage. They were the nouveau riche of their day. Though far too powerful to be looked down upon, the family's fortune was primarily built on two key pillars, banking and trade. His father, also Francis Dashwood, was a prominent merchant and banker who had a keen eye for opportunity. He wasn't afraid to get his hands dirty, so to speak, in the messy, often brutal world of international commerce. This wasn't the genteel business of loaning money to dukes for their lavish balls. This was the raw, high-stakes game of financing ships, underwriting colonial ventures, and speculating on commodities. The Dashwoods had their fingers in many pies, from the East India Company's lucrative spice trade to the burgeoning markets of the West Indies. You can almost see the ledger books, pages filled with careful, spidery script, each entry representing a fortune made or a risk taken. This was a quirky or fringe tidbit of their success, the willingness to embrace the cutthroat nature of emerging global capitalism rather than just relying on inherited land and titles. They were, in essence, the venture capitalists of the 18th century. It's this foundation of wealth that gave our Francis the freedom to pursue his eccentricities. His peers, even those with significant fortunes, often had to contend with the day-to-day management of their estates, the delicate dance of court politics, and the expectations of their lineage. But for Francis, the family fortune was already a well-oiled machine, managed by capable hands. This left him with an immense amount of time and an unlimited budget to indulge his every whim. He didn't have to worry about where the next guinea was coming from. The guineas were simply always there, arriving in steady, overwhelming streams from distant lands. It was a life of near total financial freedom, a concept so foreign to most people of the time that it was almost a form of superpower. This is a point where historians still argue whether this immense, unearned fortune was a blessing or a curse. Did it allow Francis to become a great intellectual and patron of the arts? Or did it insulate him from reality, paving the way for his later, more bizarre compulsions? You can imagine the debate, one scholar arguing that the freedom from financial worry enabled his mind to soar, while another counters that it simply removed all the natural checks and balances that might have kept his ego and his strange obsessions in check. The truth is likely somewhere in the middle, but what is clear is that without this staggering inheritance, the Francis Dashwood we're about to get to know simply wouldn't exist. He would have been just another nobleman, a name in a genealogical chart, not the legendary figure who would one day hoard a mountain of sugar. And so, we leave the ledger books and the shipping manifest behind and turn our attention to the man himself. He is no longer just a name. He is the scion of a powerful financial empire, a young man with a mind and a purse full of possibilities. His father had built the house, but Francis was free to decorate it with whatever odd and wonderful things he could find. Little did anyone know, one of those odd things would become a singular, all-consuming passion that would define his legacy and confound his world. The groundwork is laid. The money is there. The stage is set for a truly unique kind of folly. With his family's boundless wealth, a comfortable and almost invisible presence behind him, you now find yourself following a young Francis Dashwood through the smoky, lantern-lit streets of London. This isn't the London of tourists and history books. This is the London of the 18th century, a city of sharp contrasts, of immense wealth and grinding poverty, of brilliant minds and base desires. It's here in this swirling vortex of a city that Dashwood's character truly begins to take shape. He was a creature of his social circle, and his circle was unique. It was a collection of the most brilliant, most powerful, and most wonderfully bizarre men in the country. His friends were not the staid, respectable gentlemen who worried about parliamentary bills and the price of wool. They were a more vibrant, often scandalous bunch. You see him sharing a laugh with John Montague, 4th Earl of Sandwich, yes, the man who, according to a mainstream historical fact, is credited with inventing the sandwich so he wouldn't have to leave the gambling table for a meal. You can picture them, perhaps, in a private club, surrounded by the haze of tobacco smoke and the clatter of dice, debating not politics, but the merits of a recently discovered classical sculpture. Another friend might have been the artist William Hogarth, whose satirical prints captured the very essence of the debauchery and hypocrisy of the age. Hogarth's work, a quirky or fringe tidbit of the time, often depicted the kind of wild bacchanalian scenes that Dashwood and his friends were famous for, blurring the line between social commentary and a kind of artistic celebration of their own excesses. This social circle was less about networking and more about intellectual and sensory stimulation. They were men who had seen the world, read the classics, and were determined to live a life far removed from the dull conventions of their parents. They were patrons of the arts, collectors of antiquities, and fearless proponents of new ideas. But they were also pranksters and hedonists, men who believed that life was a performance and that the greatest sin was to be boring. They reveled in shocking the establishment, in pushing the boundaries of what was considered acceptable. Dashwood, with his immense wealth and a natural inclination toward the theatrical, was a perfect fit for this crowd. He wasn't just a member, he was often the ringleader, the one who would propose the next wild scheme or the most outlandish party. This is a key part of the story, because it explains how Dashwood was able to develop his eccentricities without being immediately ostracized. His social group not only tolerated his oddities, they celebrated them. He wasn't seen as a madman, but as a bon vivant, a man of wit and spirit who simply refused to be confined by the expectations of polite society. Historians still argue whether this social environment was truly liberating or if it was a toxic echo chamber that enabled and even encouraged his more self-destructive tendencies. Was he a free thinker, or was he simply a spoiled aristocrat surrounded by others who reinforced his worst impulses? The consensus, if there is one, is that it was probably a bit of both. He found a home among men who understood that a life of luxury could be more than just comfortable. It could be an art form in itself. And so, we leave the noisy, vibrant world of London's social elite for a moment and follow Dashwood into a more rarefied atmosphere, a place where his love of classical art and his desire for clandestine association would perfectly align. This is the moment where his private world starts to intersect with something more organized, more formal, and ultimately, more secret. He's no longer just a wealthy youth. He's a man with a place in a very particular kind of society, one that will forever be linked to his name. Leaving the boisterous, witty world of London's high society behind, you now find yourself in a more exclusive, more cerebral setting, one that perfectly encapsulates Francis Dashwood's dual nature. This is not the world of raucous parties, but of quiet contemplation and intellectual pursuit. We are now introduced to the Society of Dilettanti, an organization that, on its surface, seems to be the very model of refined taste and scholarly interest. It's a mainstream historical fact that this society, founded in 1734, brought together the wealthiest, most influential, and most well-traveled men in England. Their stated purpose was to promote the study of classical art and architecture, a cause that resonated deeply with Dashwood's own burgeoning interests. You can almost picture the scene: a long table in a private room, a bottle of fine port glowing in the candlelight, and a group of men in powdered wigs and silk waistcoats, not gambling or drinking to excess, but earnestly discussing the proportions of a Roman temple or the newly discovered frescoes in Pompeii. These men were the arbiters of taste, the trendsetters who dictated what was fashionable in art, design, and culture. Their influence extended far beyond their small circle, shaping the collections of museums and the design of country estates for generations to come. To be a member was to be at the very pinnacle of cultural authority. Dashwood, with his keen eye for the unique and his bottomless purse, was a natural fit. But one as with all things related to Francis Dashwood, there was a layer of playful, self-aware irony to the whole affair. The very name of the society, dilettanti, means lovers of the arts, but it also carries a subtle undertone of the amateur or the dabbler. This was a quirky or fringe tidbit of the society's identity. They were serious scholars, yes, but they never took themselves too seriously. Their meetings were often accompanied by heavy drinking and bawdy humor, and their famous motto was seria ludo. Serious things with a game. You can imagine the scene of a serious debate about the entablature of the Parthenon suddenly giving way to a riotous toast and a lewd joke about a Greek god. This blend of high culture and low comedy was a perfect reflection of Dashwood himself. He was a man who could appreciate the sublime beauty of a classical statue and, in the next breath, propose a ridiculous, theatrical prank. It's within this society that Dashwood's intellectual curiosity was honed, and his taste for the exotic was refined. He was not just a passive member, he was an active participant, helping to fund expeditions to Italy and Greece to bring back ancient treasures for the British Museum. He learned how to see the world through the lens of history, how to appreciate the craftsmanship of a bygone era, and how to acquire pieces that were not just valuable, but meaningful. This is where his obsession with collecting began to take on a more focused, a more educated shape. He wasn't just buying things anymore. He was curating a world, a personal museum that reflected his own eclectic and brilliant mind. Historians still argue whether the Society of Dilettanti was a genuine scholarly institution or just a cleverly disguised excuse for wealthy gentlemen to drink and carouse. Was their work a sincere effort to preserve history, or was it simply another form of social posturing, a way for the rich to flaunt their cultural capital? The answer, as always, is that it was probably both. They left a remarkable legacy of art and scholarship, but they did it with a wink and a glass of port. And it was in this environment of serious play that Francis Dashwood's taste for the rare and the beautiful was fully awakened. A taste that would eventually lead him down a path that was far less about ancient history and far more about a very modern, very sweet obsession. Having found his intellectual home in the Society of Dilettanti, you now see Francis Dashwood's tastes becoming more refined and, simultaneously, more voracious. This isn't just about admiring classical antiquity anymore. It's about a deep-seated fascination with the exotic, the rare, and the utterly foreign. His time in London and his associations with men who had traveled the globe had sparked a fire in him, a desire to own not just works of art, but pieces of the world itself. This was a hunger that couldn't be sated by a simple collection of books or paintings. He wanted things that spoke of distant lands, of different cultures, of materials and tastes that were completely unknown in England. This burgeoning fascination for the exotic was a mainstream historical fact for many wealthy Englishmen of the era. The burgeoning British Empire was bringing back an incredible array of goods from all corners of the globe: silks from India, spices from the East Indies, and strange new plants from the Americas. But while many of his peers were content with a decorative porcelain vase or a new kind of tea, Dashwood's taste ran deeper. He sought out the unusual, the obscure, and the uniquely challenging to acquire. He wasn't just a consumer of these new goods, he was a connoisseur of them. You can imagine him in a quiet corner of a merchant's shop, not haggling over the price of a common spice, but meticulously examining a small, intricate jade figurine from China, a piece that had probably taken months to travel across the globe. He was a man who understood that the true value of an object was not just in its cost, but in its story, its rarity, and the journey it took to get to him. This fascination manifested in a variety of ways. A quirky or fringe tidbit of his personality was his obsession with unusual foods and beverages. He was among the first in England to experiment with strange, foreign ingredients that were arriving on trade ships. While others were satisfied with beef and potatoes, Dashwood was ordering crates of new, unheard-of fruits and vegetables, and he would host dinner parties where the menu was a baffling and delicious mystery. He would have his servants prepare dishes with spices that no one in England had ever tasted before, delighting in the shocked and often pleased reactions of his guests. This wasn't just about showing off. It was about an intellectual curiosity, a desire to experience the world through all his senses. He was, in essence, a culinary adventurer, using his vast wealth to explore the very boundaries of taste. This is a point where historians still argue whether his taste for the exotic was a genuine love of new cultures or just another form of colonial-era appropriation and display. Was he a true global citizen, a man ahead of his time who saw beauty in the diversity of the world? Or was he simply a wealthy man who saw the world as a catalog from which to order the next interesting novelty? The debate is a fascinating one, because it gets to the heart of how we view the past. Was he a visionary, or was he just a very well-funded dilettante? The answer, as always, is probably a mix of the two. But what is certain is that this early, widespread fascination with the exotic would eventually narrow in focus, like a lens focusing on a single, brilliant point, and that point, that single object of his most profound obsession, would soon become clear. The stage is being set for his most infamous and defining characteristic, one that was born from this love of the new, the strange, and the profoundly sweet. The stage is set, the actor is ready, and now it's time for the curtain to rise on Francis Dashwood's most formative journey, the Grand Tour. This wasn't just a vacation, it was a rite of passage for every wealthy young man in 18th century England. A mainstream historical fact that defined a generation, it was a journey through Europe, and sometimes beyond, designed to refine one's taste, broaden one's mind, and provide a healthy dose of adventure before settling down into the staid life of a nobleman. But Dashwood's grand tour was, predictably, anything but typical. You can imagine him, not just traveling in a grand coach with a tutor, but in a small, fast carriage, a wild look in his eye. He didn't just visit the major cities, he devoured them. He started in Paris, not just for the art, but for the witty salons and the scandalous philosophers. He then made his way through Italy, a true mecca for any member of the Society of Dilettanti. He wasn't content to simply gaze at the Colosseum. He was rumored to have snuck in at night to hold mock ceremonies with his friends. This was a man who didn't just want to see history, he wanted to live it, to be a part of it, even if it meant a little bit of playful sacrilege. It was here, in the sun-drenched cities of Italy, that his love for classical art and architecture became a full-blown obsession, a passion he would later use to design his own estate. But his travels didn't stop at the conventional boundaries of the Grand Tour. A quirky or fringe tidbit of his travels was his journey to the Near East. He didn't just travel to Venice, he pushed on to Constantinople, the exotic, bustling heart of the Ottoman Empire. While there, he immersed himself in a culture completely different from his own, collecting not just antiquities but also ideas, clothing, and even customs. You can picture him, dressed in what he believed to be traditional Turkish garb, smoking from a long pipe and regaling his friends with tales of the bustling bazaars and the strange new foods he had tasted. It was a performance, yes, but it was also a genuine attempt to understand a world that was utterly foreign to him. He was a man who embraced a challenge, and the challenge of understanding a new culture was one he undertook with gusto. This journey, more than anything else, was what prepared him for his future obsessions. It taught him that the world was vast and full of wonders, and that anything, no matter how strange or rare, could be acquired for the right price. He learned the logistical difficulties of moving treasures across continents and the art of negotiation with merchants who spoke a different language. He learned to trust his own judgment, to see value where others saw only foreign oddity. This grand tour wasn't just an educational journey, it was an education in acquisition, a masterclass in how to turn a desire into a reality, no matter how difficult or eccentric that desire might be. Historians still argue whether his time abroad made him a more enlightened individual or simply reinforced his belief that his immense wealth could buy him access to any experience he desired. Did his travels make him a true connoisseur of the world, or did they simply turn him into a more sophisticated consumer? The debate is a fascinating one because it gets to the heart of how we see the impact of wealth on a person's character. Was he a man who saw the world for all its beauty and strangeness? Or was he just another rich tourist with a shopping list? The truth is, his experiences on the Grand Tour and in the Near East would not only shape his future home, but also provide the foundation for a particular, very sweet obsession that would soon become the defining characteristic of his life. Having returned from his epic Grand Tour, laden with treasures and stories, you now see Francis Dashwood not just as a man of refined taste, but as a man of secrets. The public face was that of a celebrated connoisseur, a patron of the arts, and a charming, if slightly eccentric, nobleman. But behind the closed doors of his London townhouse and in the hushed conversations of his inner circle, there were whispers of a secret society. This is a mainstream historical fact that is still shrouded in a mix of rumor and truth. His travels to the Near East, in particular, had exposed him to various esoteric traditions and clandestine organizations that existed on the fringes of the European establishment. He wasn't just interested in the aesthetics of different cultures, he was interested in their hidden knowledge, their rituals, and their secret societies. It's in this period that you first hear the hushed mention of a group that would later become famously or infamously known as the Hellfire Club. This was not a formal organization with a public charter. It was a clandestine gathering of like-minded men who sought to push the boundaries of social and religious convention. They were a mix of politicians, artists, and aristocrats, all united by a shared sense of intellectual curiosity and a deep-seated contempt for the hypocrisy they saw in polite society. They met in secret, often in rented rooms or private homes, to engage in activities that were part philosophical debate, part theatrical performance, and part outright debauchery. The group was, in a sense, a more structured and more secret version of the wild social circle he had left behind in London. A quirky or fringe tidbit of their early gatherings was the use of costumes and pseudonyms. They didn't just sit around and talk, they adopted personas, creating an almost theatrical reality for themselves where they could shed the burdens of their public identities. One member might be the Sultan, another the Pope, and Dashwood himself was often referred to as the Abbot. This was more than just a game. It was a way to create a space where the rules of society didn't apply, a world where they could be truly themselves, or at least a more unfiltered version of themselves. This early incarnation of the Hellfire Club was less about shock value and more about a kind of intellectual rebellion, a private rejection of the norms that governed their public lives. Historians still argue whether this secret society was a genuine philosophical movement or just a cover for a group of wealthy men to indulge in their vices without fear of public scrutiny. Was it a noble pursuit of truth and freedom, or was it simply a more elaborate form of a boys' club, a place for powerful men to let loose and feel a sense of shared camaraderie? The truth is, it was likely both. They were, in many ways, men ahead of their time, questioning the very foundations of their society, but they were also products of their time, men of immense privilege who could afford to indulge in such risky and scandalous behavior. This period of clandestine meetings and private rituals was the perfect training ground for Dashwood's later, more public displays of eccentricity. He was learning how to build a world within a world, a place that was completely his own, where his rules and his desires were the only things that mattered. And this ability to create his own reality, to build a sanctuary for his obsessions, would soon become his greatest talent and his greatest folly. With his reputation for wit and scandal firmly established, and his mind brimming with ideas from his grand tour, you now follow Francis Dashwood as he embarks on his greatest project to date the construction of West Wycombe Park. This wasn't just a home, it was a personal monument to his wealth, his travels, and his incredibly peculiar tastes. The estate, nestled in the rolling Buckinghamshire countryside, was to be a physical representation of his mind, a place where classical antiquity, natural beauty, and a certain whimsical decadence all met. The entire project was a mainstream historical fact, a massive undertaking that would consume years of his life and a staggering amount of his fortune. You can imagine the scene: the vast, empty fields of his family's estate, once a simple farming landscape, now a buzzing hive of activity. Architects and landscape designers, sculptors and stonemasons, all working to realize Dashwood's grand, sometimes baffling vision. He wasn't content to simply build a manor house. He wanted to create an entire world. The house itself was designed in the Palladian style, a tribute to the classical architecture he had so admired in Italy. But if you look closer, you can see Dashwood's personality peeking through the grandeur. The statues weren't just of noble gods and goddesses. They were often of figures in lewd or comical poses, a subtle wink to his friends, and a complete send-up of the pomposity of his peers. This was a quirky or fringe tidbit of his design philosophy. He saw the world as a stage and his home as its set. The grounds themselves were a masterpiece of landscape gardening, designed to evoke the romanticized ruins he had seen on his grand tour. He built temples and grottos, statues and follies, each one a reference to a classical myth or a personal joke. The most famous of these was a series of caves dug into the hillside, which would later become the infamous meeting place for his secret society. But even in their early stages, the caves were a symbol of his desire to create a world where he was in complete control, a hidden sanctuary from the judgmental eyes of the world. He was building more than a house. He was building an intellectual and physical playground for himself and his friends. Historians still argue whether West Wycombe Park was a genuine architectural masterpiece or simply an incredibly expensive vanity project. Was Dashwood a visionary who saw the potential for art and landscape to come together in a new way? Or was he just a spoiled aristocrat with too much money and a desperate need to be noticed? The debate is a fascinating one because it speaks to the very nature of art itself. Can something be both a personal expression and a work of genius? The answer is probably yes. But in Dashwood's case, the two were so intertwined that it's impossible to separate them. West Wycombe Park was a reflection of the man himself, beautiful, brilliant, and deeply, deeply strange. And it was here, in this meticulously curated world of his own making, that he would eventually find the perfect home for his most bizarre and enduring obsession. The stage is now set for his sweetest folly, with his estate, West Wycombe Park, now taking shape. You can't help but pause and truly appreciate its peculiar nature. This wasn't a standard country house. It was an architectural masterpiece that simultaneously verged on a whimsical, highbrow parody. A mainstream historical fact is that the Palladian style he chose was all the rage, a nod to the classical ideals of ancient Rome and Greece. But where other noblemen built serious, sober monuments to their own gravitas, Dashwood infused his with a sense of playful absurdity. You can see it in the details. The portico, so grand and imposing from a distance, upon closer inspection, might feature a carving that is just a little too cheeky, a little too suggestive for polite society. It's a bit like finding a whoopee cushion on a throne. He took the established rules of architecture and twisted them just enough to make them his own, turning a tribute into a private joke. But the real genius and the real strangeness was in the grounds. A quirky or fringe tidbit of his design was the use of what were known as follies. These were structures built purely for decoration, not for function, and they were all the rage. But Dashwood's follies were different. They weren't just pretty distractions. They were a narrative, a series of classical temples and ruined arches that told a story. One might be a tribute to Bacchus, the god of wine and revelry, while another, a small, unassuming temple, might be a nod to a more obscure, pagan deity. He even built a series of caves that led deep into the earth, which were not just for show, but for a far more practical and secretive purpose. The entire estate was a kind of open-air puzzle, a physical representation of Dashwood's mind complex, erudite, and more than a little bit mischievous. Historians still argue whether West Wycombe Park was a work of genuine artistic genius or simply a reflection of Dashwood's unchecked ego. Was he a brilliant designer who understood the power of irony in art, a precursor to the postmodernist thinkers of the future? Or was he simply a rich man with too much time on his hands, using his fortune to build a monument to his own self-importance? The debate is a lively one, because it speaks to the nature of intent in art. We see the finished product, a beautiful and bewildering estate, but we're left to guess at the motivation behind it. Was it a sincere expression of his love for the classics, or was it a grand, theatrical set for the secret society that was soon to emerge? The truth, as is often the case with Dashwood, is probably that it was both. It was a beautiful place, a monument to a beautiful mind, but it was also a stage, a backdrop for a story that was about to get very, very strange. This estate wasn't just a home, it was a sanctuary, a place where he could be completely himself, and it was about to become the center of his most infamous project. Now that the stage of West Wycombe Park is largely set, you see Francis Dashwood's more private life taking a turn towards the organized and the infamous. The whispers you heard earlier about a secret society were not just rumors. They were the nascent rumblings of what would become the Hellfire Club. This club's genesis is a mainstream historical fact, an event often exaggerated but rooted in genuine social rebellion. It wasn't a spontaneous gathering. It was a deliberate and calculated act of social and philosophical defiance. Dashwood, along with a few of his closest, most eccentric friends, decided to create a private world for themselves, a sanctuary from the judgmental eyes of a society they found to be utterly hypocritical. The club's origins can be traced back to a series of more casual and slightly less scandalous groups. One of these was the Divan Club, a group of men who, like Dashwood, had traveled to the Near East and were fascinated by its culture. Another was the Knights of St. Francis, a group of men who met at a private tavern in London to drink, gamble, and engage in witty, often blasphemous, conversation. The Hellfire Club was, in essence, the culmination of these smaller, more informal gatherings. It was the moment when Dashwood decided to formalize their shared contempt for social norms into a structured, albeit secretive, organization. This was a quirky or fringe tidbit of its history. It wasn't born out of a single idea, but was the natural evolution of a group of like-minded men seeking a more permanent and secure space for their debauchery. The members themselves were a who's who of 18th century English society, a roll call of powerful men who, in their public lives, held positions of immense authority. There were politicians, peers, and even poets. These men, in their private lives, were seeking something more, something that their public roles simply could not provide. The club was, for them, a form of escapism, a place where they could shed the mask of respectability and be their authentic, often scandalous, selves. The secrecy of the club was not just for the thrill of it was a necessity. In an era where a man's reputation was his most valuable asset, being associated with a group that openly mocked religion and engaged in scandalous behavior could have been ruinous. Historians still argue whether the Hellfire Club was a genuine philosophical movement or just an elaborate excuse for a group of wealthy men to engage in scandalous behavior. Was it a noble experiment in intellectual and personal freedom, a precursor to modern libertarianism? Or was it simply a more sophisticated version of a college fraternity, a place for powerful men to be bad boys without facing any real consequences? The debate is a lively one, and the truth, as always, is probably somewhere in the middle. But what is clear is that the club's founding was a pivotal moment in Dashwood's life. It was a physical manifestation of his desire to create his own world, to live by his own rules, and to share that world with a select few who understood and appreciated his particular brand of genius and mischief. The stage is set, the players are assembled, and the drama is about to begin in the most unlikely of places, the caves beneath his own country estate. The Hellfire Club, now officially formed, was not just about scandalous rituals, it was a blend of serious purpose and theatrical debauchery. The group, a mainstream historical fact that still fascinates and repels, was led by Francis Dashwood, who adopted the title The Abbot. Their grand purpose, or at least the one they presented to each other, was to mock the hypocrisy of the established church and society. They saw the public face of religion as a sham, a tool for social control rather than a path to spiritual truth. Their meetings were a deliberate and often profane parody of religious ceremonies. They would read from a corrupted version of the Bible, sing twisted hymns, and even use religious symbols in a way that was meant to shock and amuse. This wasn't just a party, it was a philosophical statement, a rebellion against the stuffy, moralistic world they inhabited. But as with all things Dashwood, there was a layer of pure, unadulterated hedonism. A quirky or fringe tidbit of their purpose was the pursuit of pleasure in all its forms. The meetings were infamous for their extravagant banquets, free-flowing wine, and, if the rumors are to be believed, the presence of prostitutes who were often referred to as nuns or other religious figures in their elaborate role-playing games. The club was a place where all of a man's desires, be they intellectual, carnal, or simply a desire to be silly and shocking, could be indulged without consequence. They created a space where the rules of the outside world didn't apply, a secret sanctuary from the prying eyes of their peers. This was the ultimate expression of their privilege, the ability to create their own moral universe, to be as bad as they wanted to be, and then return to their respectable lives without a single scratch on their reputations. Historians still argue whether the Hellfire Club's purpose was genuinely about intellectual rebellion or simply a more elaborate and theatrical excuse for debauchery. Were they true freethinkers, pioneers of a more secular and enlightened age, or were they just a group of spoiled rich kids playing dress-up and getting drunk? The answer is likely both. Their actions were a genuine rejection of the societal norms of their time, a very real challenge to the power of the church and the aristocracy. But they also did it with a kind of privileged carelessness, a sense that they were untouchable and that their actions, no matter how scandalous, would have no real consequences. This period of his life, this deep dive into the world of secret societies and playful sacrilege, was a crucial part of his development. It was here that he learned to turn his private obsessions into a shared, public spectacle, and it was a skill that he would soon apply to a much stranger and much sweeter project. You are now deep within the heart of the Hellfire Club, a place where Francis Dashwood's blend of intellectual parody and genuine hedonism found its perfect home. The bizarre rituals of the monks, as they called themselves, were the very core of the club's identity. It's a mainstream historical fact that these ceremonies were held in the elaborate network of man-made caves beneath West Wycombe Park, a setting that added an almost theatrical, Gothic drama to their proceedings. Imagine a group of powerful men, their faces illuminated by the flickering light of 100 candles, dressed in robes that were a deliberate and crude parody of monastic habits. They would gather around a stone altar, not for worship, but for a feast that was as decadent as it was blasphemous. This wasn't just a secret society, it was a living, breathing piece of performance art. The rituals themselves were a quirky or fringe tidbit of the club's history, often involving a mock sermon delivered by Dashwood, the abbot, from a high pulpit, but instead of reading from the scriptures, he would read from a scroll he had written himself, filled with lewd jokes and satirical poems. The members would respond not with amen, but with a chorus of theatrical groans and laughs, turning a sacred ceremony into a drunken comedy show. They had their own unique vocabulary, their own hand gestures, and their own set of rules, all of which were designed to create a sense of shared belonging and intellectual rebellion. One of the most famous rumors was that they would use a monkey dressed as the devil as a kind of mascot, a detail that, even if untrue, perfectly captures the spirit of their playful sacrilege. They were, in essence, creating their own religion, one where the only gods were wit, pleasure, and each other. Historians still argue whether the rituals of the Hellfire Club were truly a form of black magic and Satanism, as their critics claimed, or if they were just a highbrow form of role-playing and satire. Were they genuinely trying to summon the devil, or were they just using the imagery of evil to shock and amuse themselves and each other? The debate is a fascinating one, because it gets to the heart of how we interpret the past. Is a performance of evil the same thing as a belief in it? For most historians, the answer is a resounding no. The club was, for the most part, a satirical experiment, a way for wealthy men to blow off steam and challenge the boundaries of what was considered acceptable. But the rumors, the whispers, and the sheer audacity of their rituals would follow Francis Dashwood for the rest of his life, permanently staining his reputation with the mark of the scandalous and the profane. This ability to create a world of his own, a world that was both shocking and deeply personal, would prove to be a central theme in his life, one that would soon turn from theatrical religion to a much sweeter and more bizarre obsession. Having delved into the scandalous, semi-private world of the Hellfire Club, you now need to step back and examine the often overlooked foundation of Francis Dashwood's entire universe: money. We've established that he was a man of immense wealth, but to understand his particular brand of obsession, we need to get specific about its source. His fortune, and that of his family, was a mainstream historical fact that was not built on ancient lands alone, but on the raw, often brutal, engine of the 18th century global economy. His father was a financier and merchant, a shrewd businessman who had a particular knack for identifying opportunities in the burgeoning colonial trade. The true source of his wealth, the wellspring from which all his follies and eccentricities flowed, was the sugar trade. This was a quirky or fringe tidbit of his biography that was often overshadowed by his more salacious reputation. The Dashwood family had significant investments in the West Indies, the heartland of the British Sugar Empire. These weren't just passive investments, they were active and often ruthless ventures. They owned shares in shipping companies that transported the raw sugar cane, and they were financiers for the plantations themselves. The family's wealth, the very money that paid for the Palladian mansion and the classical follies, was, in a very real and tangible way, a product of the white gold that was being harvested and processed thousands of miles away. This is a point where historians still argue whether the Dashwood family's direct involvement in the sugar trade was a form of enlightened entrepreneurialism or a more sinister and exploitative form of capitalism. Was it simply a shrewd business decision that allowed them to participate in the most lucrative market of the age? Or was it a morally bankrupt venture that was complicit in one of the greatest human rights atrocities in history? The debate is a difficult one because it forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth about the origins of so many great English fortunes. Dashwood's wealth was not clean. It was stained with the sweat, blood, and tears of the enslaved people who worked the plantations in brutal conditions to satisfy Europe's insatiable craving for sweetness. This understanding of the source of his wealth is crucial for what comes next. It's a powerful and often overlooked piece of the puzzle. The very commodity that made his life of leisure and luxury possible would soon become the single, defining obsession of his later life. He wasn't just a wealthy man with an unusual hobby. He was a man who, in a strange and convoluted way, was trying to bring the source of his power and fortune home with him. He was building a world, a beautiful and bizarre sanctuary, that was funded by the brutal realities of the global trade. And he was about to fill that sanctuary with the very commodity that made it all possible. The stage is set for the start of his great, sugary madness. You are now armed with the crucial knowledge that Francis Dashwood's fortune, and his very way of life, was built on sugar. To understand his obsession, You must first understand sugar's profound power in the 18th century. This wasn't just a simple sweetener, it was the white gold of the era. It's a mainstream historical fact that sugar, once a rare luxury for kings and queens, had become the defining commodity of the burgeoning global economy. Its popularity was a testament to a changing world, where a craving for sweetness was fueling a network of trade, colonization, and brutal exploitation that spanned the globe. Imagine the sheer scale of it. British ships, their holds groaning with the weight of raw sugar cane, crisscrossed the Atlantic. This sugar wasn't just for putting in your tea, though that was becoming a new national obsession. It was for everything, for preserved fruits, for elaborate pastries, for rum, and for the increasingly popular chocolate. The demand was insatiable, and the profits were astronomical. Fortunes were made and lost on the price of a single shipload. This was an age where sugar was more valuable, pound for pound, than many precious metals. Its economic and social impact was so profound that it reshaped entire cultures, creating a new class of incredibly wealthy merchants and a new kind of consumer who saw sweetness not as a treat, but as a staple. A quirky or fringe tidbit of this era was the rise of the sugar cube. Before this, sugar was sold in massive conical loaves called sugar loaves. A household would have to chip away at these hard, unwieldy cones with a special tool, making the process of adding sugar a messy, labor-intensive affair. The invention of the sugar cube, a simple, elegant solution, revolutionized how people consume sugar and further cemented its place in daily life. This small detail, this transformation from a clunky cone to a neat cube, is a perfect analogy for how the world was being reshaped by this one commodity, becoming more convenient, more controlled, and ultimately, more addictive. Historians still argue whether this era should be defined by the economic genius of the merchants who built these empires or by the moral catastrophe of the slavery that made it all possible. Was the sugar trade a necessary evil, the engine of modernity that created a new, prosperous middle class in Europe? Or was it a fundamentally corrupt and inhumane system that poisoned the very idea of progress? The debate is a difficult one because it forces us to confront the uncomfortable reality that so much of the wealth and comfort of the Western world was built on a foundation of unimaginable suffering. This is the world that Francis Dashwood inhabited, and it is the world that gave him the means to pursue his most bizarre and enduring obsession. The sugar that would soon begin to pile up in his private vault was not just a commodity, it was the distilled essence of this complex and contradictory age. To truly understand the source of Francis Dashwood's wealth and the origin of his great, sugary obsession, you must peer into the dark underbelly of the sugar trade. This is where the glamour of wealth and the romance of exotic commodities gives way to a grim and brutal reality. The sheer volume of sugar that fueled Europe's sweet tooth was made possible by an equally staggering volume of human suffering. It's a mainstream historical fact that the vast majority of sugar produced in the British West Indies was cultivated and harvested by enslaved people. This wasn't just a grim detail, it was the foundation of the entire industry. The Dashwood family, through their investments in plantations and shipping, were inextricably linked to this brutal system. You can almost feel the heat in the humidity of the sugar plantations, a world away from the manicured lawns of West Wycombe Park. The work was unimaginably hard, often fatal. Enslaved people were forced to toil in the fields under the blazing Caribbean sun, cutting the razor-sharp cane with machetes. The processing of the cane was even more dangerous. A hellish environment of boiling vats of molasses and powerful grinding machines. Life expectancy on these plantations was brutally short, and the cruelty was unimaginable. This was a horrifying, yet central aspect of the sugar trade. The sweetness that a London nobleman enjoyed in his tea was literally the product of a bitter, violent, and dehumanizing system. A quirky or fringe tidbit of the sugar trade was the role of rum. Rum, a byproduct of the sugar-making process, became an incredibly valuable commodity in its own right. Used as currency, and a key part of the infamous triangular trade. It was often given to enslaved people as a way to control them, a short-lived escape from the reality of their existence, and was a powerful symbol of the cruelty and exploitation that was inherent in the system. The Dashwood family's investments would have included rum, a secondary but no less lucrative product of their primary business. The profits from this trade, this brutal cycle of production and exploitation, were what paid for Dashwood's grand tour, his collection of antiquities and his lavish estate. Historians still argue whether a man like Francis Dashwood, so insulated by wealth and geography, would have been aware of or morally culpable for the suffering that funded his lifestyle. Did he simply see his investments as numbers on a ledger, detached from the human cost, or did he have a deep, unspoken awareness of the brutality that was fueling his wealth? And did that awareness, in some strange, convoluted way, fuel his later obsessions? The debate is a difficult one because it's a question of both personal responsibility and the pervasive moral blindness of an entire age. What is clear is that the sugar that would soon begin to pile up in his private vault was not just a commodity, it was a potent symbol of the era's greatest moral contradictions. It was the product of a system that could create unimaginable wealth and unimaginable suffering at the same time. And Dashwood, in his own strange way, was about to become the caretaker of its most potent symbol. The stage is set, the money is there, and now the defining moment of Francis Dashwood's obsession is about to unfold. You can almost hear the creak of the wagon wheels on the long, winding road to West Wycombe Park. A massive, unprecedented shipment of sugar is on its way. This is a mainstream historical fact, a moment that would forever change the narrative of his life from a quirky nobleman to a full-blown eccentric. This wasn't just a few barrels. This was a colossal delivery, a shipment so large it would have been more at home on a dockside warehouse than in the courtyard of a private estate. You can imagine the murmuring of the servants and the local villagers as they watched the procession of heavily laden carts trundling up the long drive. What could one man possibly do with that much sugar? The sheer volume of it was baffling. It was more than a lifetime supply for 100 families. This arrival was not just a delivery, it was an event. A quirky or fringe tidbit of this time was the practice of sweetening the deal. It was common for merchants to offer small gifts of sugar to their clients as a sign of good faith. But this was on a different scale entirely. Dashwood had negotiated a deal so large and so specific that it would have required a merchant with significant colonial holdings to fulfill. He wasn't buying from a local grocer. He was buying directly from the source, or as close to it as he could get. He had, in essence, used his family's immense wealth and connections to bypass the usual channels of trade and bring a piece of the colonial empire directly to his home. This act of acquisition was not about simple consumption. It was about possession on a grand, almost imperial scale. Historians still argue whether Dashwood's acquisition of this sugar was a deliberate act of hoarding from the start, or if it was an impulsive decision that grew into an obsession. Was he a man with a clear plan, a visionary who saw the value in an untapped commodity? Or was he a rich man who saw a deal and simply couldn't resist, not realizing the consequences of his actions? The debate is a fascinating one because it speaks to the nature of obsession itself. Is it born from a single moment of madness, or is it a slow, creeping disease that takes hold over time? We will never truly know. But what we do know is that the arrival of this sugar was the point of no return. The carts were there, the sugar was on his land, and the true, bizarre journey of Francis Dashwood was about to begin in earnest. He was about to embark on a quest not for power or love, but for a singular, all-consuming sweetness. With the arrival of that colossal shipment, you now stand witness to the moment Francis Dashwood's eccentricity tips over into full-blown obsession. The hoarding begins. This isn't a mainstream historical fact you'll find in every textbook, but rather a central, defining episode of his life. A moment when a man of great wealth and unusual tastes decided to dedicate his life not to art, politics, or pleasure, but to a single, crystalline commodity, He didn't just store the sugar, he began to accumulate it with a fervor that bordered on the religious. He used his family's connections and fortune to place order after order, buying sugar in bulk from merchants who, while confused, were more than happy to sell to a man who didn't seem to care about the price. You can imagine the conversations. A local merchant, used to selling a few loaves of sugar a week, is suddenly faced with an order for 100 weight. He'd be baffled. But who's he to question a letter arrives from a shipping company in London? A contract to deliver several tons of raw sugar from the docks to West Wycombe? The clerks would have been astonished. The paperwork would have been immense. This was a private man, a single person, attempting to control a commodity on a scale usually reserved for national governments or massive trading companies. It was a quirky or fringe tidbit of his personality. He treated his private obsession with the same seriousness and logistical planning as a military campaign. The sheer volume of the sugar was a problem in itself. Where do you put it all? The first few deliveries could be stored in a regular cellar, but as the shipments continued, the space began to run out. Dashwood didn't care. He simply bought more, and then more. He began to dedicate entire outbuildings to his growing hoard. A stable, emptied of its horses, became a warehouse for barrels of molasses. A small decorative barn on the edge of his property was filled to the brim with sugar loaves, stacked precariously high like a sweet, white Jenga tower. His obsession wasn't just about having the sugar, it was about the act of acquisition, the thrill of possession on a scale that no one else could possibly imagine. Historians still argue whether this hoarding was a genuine psychological compulsion or if it was a calculated act of rebellion against the norms of his society. Was he a man who was simply so wealthy that he had run out of other things to want, turning to a simple commodity as the ultimate symbol of his power? Or was he a man who was, in a very real way, losing his grip on reality, his mind slowly consumed by a strange and solitary madness? The debate is a fascinating one because it speaks to the very nature of human desire. We may never know the true reason behind his actions, but what is clear is that this moment, the moment the hoarding began in earnest, was a point of no return. The noble lord was now a collector of sugar, and his collection was about to become the most important thing in his world. The stage is set for the creation of his most bizarre and enduring masterpiece, a secret vault for his sugary treasure. You now see Francis Dashwood's obsession with sugar moving beyond simple acquisition and into the complex world of logistics. Securing the precious commodity wasn't just a matter of writing a check. It was a feat of planning and resourcefulness that would have been a challenge for a small government. This is a mainstream historical fact that highlights his dedication to his singular pursuit. He had to navigate the labyrinthine world of 18th century commerce, dealing with merchants, ship captains, and a network of middlemen, all while keeping his bizarre purchases as quiet as possible. His fortune was his greatest tool, allowing him to command the resources necessary for such a large-scale operation. He was in effect running his own personal import business with a single, very sweet product. The logistical nightmare of obtaining and transporting this much sugar was immense. Sugar, in its raw form, was a heavy, bulky, and delicate commodity. It was shipped in barrels or huge conical loaves, each one weighing a considerable amount. You can imagine the difficulties arranging for ships to carry the barrels from the West Indies to London, a dangerous journey fraught with storms and pirates. Then, once at the docks, securing a team of wagons and a small army of laborers to transport the sugar the 50 miles from London to West Wycombe. The roads were notoriously bad, and a single broken axle or a heavy rainstorm could have spelled disaster. This was a quirky or fringe tidbit of his obsession, the fact that he was willing to go through so much trouble for a commodity that could be bought in small quantities at any local grocer's shop. He was not just buying sugar, he was engaging in a ritual, a complicated, logistical dance that affirmed his control and his ability to bend the world to his will. Historians still argue whether Dashwood's obsessive hoarding and the elaborate logistics he employed were a sign of his entrepreneurial genius or a symptom of a deeper psychological issue. Was he a man ahead of his time, a kind of pre-industrial supply chain manager who saw value in controlling the entire process from start to finish? Or was he simply a man whose immense wealth had removed all the natural checks and balances that would have told him that what he was doing was insane? The debate is a fascinating one because it forces us to confront the fine line between genius and madness. In another era, a man who built such a complex system for a single purpose might have been hailed as an innovator. But in Dashwood's case, his purpose was so strange that it forever painted him as an eccentric. He had successfully secured his treasure, and now he was about to create the perfect home for it, a testament to his obsession that would stand as a silent, sugary monument for years to come. The sugar is secured, the logistics are in place, and now you are privy to Francis Dashwood's next great undertaking, building a special, dedicated storeroom for his growing hoard. This wasn't just a simple cellar or a spare room. This was a purpose-built structure, a testament to his obsession that was both a marvel of engineering and a bizarre private shrine. It's a mainstream historical fact that he used his architectural knowledge, honed by his grand tour and his work on West Wycombe Park, to design a space that was perfect for his unusual collection. This wasn't about aesthetics, it was about preservation. You can imagine the scene: a team of masons and carpenters, utterly confused, working on a project that defied all common sense. They weren't building a new wing for a library or a grand ballroom, they were building a climate-controlled vault. The location was a quirky or fringe tidbit of his obsession. He chose a spot deep within the grounds, away from the main house, to ensure absolute privacy. The vault was a masterclass in construction for its time. It was built with thick stone walls to insulate it from the temperature fluctuations of the English countryside. The entrance was a heavy, iron-bound door, not to keep out thieves, but to keep out the damp, a mortal enemy of sugar. He even designed a simple ventilation system to ensure a constant flow of dry air, a detail that would have been completely unheard of for a simple storeroom. This wasn't just a rich man with a hobby. This was a man who had dedicated his considerable intellect and resources to a single, strange cause. Historians still argue whether the construction of this vault was the definitive moment when Dashwood's eccentricity turned into a full-blown psychological compulsion. Was it the final piece of a carefully planned performance, an architectural folly designed to confound and amuse his inner circle? Or was it a genuine sign of a man's mind unraveling, a desperate attempt to control a world that was becoming increasingly chaotic and strange to him? The debate is a fascinating one, because it's so hard to separate the man from the myth. Was he an artist, a madman, or both? What is clear is that this vault was his magnum opus, a physical representation of his obsession that was both beautiful and terrifying in its single-mindedness. The vault was ready, and soon it would be filled with his sugary treasure, becoming the very heart of his strange, new world. You've followed the journey from a vague idea to a logistical masterpiece, and now you stand at the threshold of the sugar vault. This is the moment you step inside, a moment of profound, quiet strangeness. The air is cool and dry, a stark contrast to the humid world outside. The space is vast, cavernous, and utterly silent. It is a mainstream historical fact that while other noblemen filled their vaults with gold, silver, or priceless works of art, Francis Dashwood chose a different kind of treasure. You're surrounded by it. Piles of raw, conical sugar loaves are stacked meticulously high, glistening like stalagmites in the soft light of a few carefully placed oil lamps. Barrels of crystallized sugar, each one a fortune in itself, line the walls in neat, orderly rows. The scent is overwhelming, a thick, intoxicating perfume of pure sweetness that hangs in the air like a fog. The interior of the vault is a testament to Dashwood's mind. It's a combination of practical engineering and whimsical artistry. The walls, so thick and strong on the outside, are lined with what appears to be a kind of polished limestone, a detail that was both a practical way to keep out the damp and a quirky or fringe tidbit of his aesthetic, making the space feel like an ancient Roman bath or a hidden grotto. But instead of water or statues, It is filled with sugar. In the center of the room, there is a small, raised platform where a single, massive sugar loaf, perhaps the first he ever acquired, sits like a crown jewel on a pedestal. It's a shrine, a temple to his obsession, and you are standing in its heart. This wasn't just a storeroom, it was a physical representation of his psychological state, a place of profound control and manic dedication. Historians still argue whether this vault was a beautiful expression of an artist's vision or a chilling symbol of a man's descent into madness. Was he a genius who saw the inherent beauty in a simple commodity and gave it the reverence it deserved? Or was he a deeply disturbed individual, using his wealth to create a sanctuary from a world he couldn't understand? A world that was becoming increasingly hostile to his brand of eccentricity. The debate is a fascinating one because it speaks to the very nature of human perception. To one person, this vault might seem like the height of elegant, a beautiful and bewildering folly. To another, it might seem like a terrifying symbol of a mind that had completely lost its way. What is clear, however, is that this vault was his secret, his sanctuary, and it was soon to become the center of a much larger and much more public drama. The world outside, a world that was not as sweet as his, was about to come knocking on his very large, very heavy door. The private sanctuary of the sugar vault couldn't stay a secret forever. As the vast unprecedented deliveries continued to arrive at West Wycombe Park, the public's reaction began to turn from quiet confusion to outright gossip. This is a mainstream historical fact that highlights the sheer scale of Dashwood's folly. A nobleman hoarding sugar was not a normal topic of conversation, and the sheer volume of his acquisitions was so far beyond the pale that it became a source of endless speculation. The local villagers, who had seen cart after cart of the white gold trundle pass their homes, would have been the first to whisper. From there, the rumors would have spread to the taverns of London, and eventually to the glittering ballrooms where Dashwood and his friends moved. The rumors were a tapestry of truth and wild exaggeration, a quirky or fringe tidbit of his evolving reputation. Some said he was a madman, a recluse who had lost his mind to a strange, sugary madness. Other, with a more cynical bent, speculated that he was a genius, a man who foresaw some great scarcity and was preparing for it. There were even more outlandish theories that he was using the sugar in some kind of bizarre, occult rituals in the caves, a new and sweeter kind of Hellfire Club ceremony. People love a good conspiracy theory, and Dashwood, with his already scandalous reputation, was the perfect subject for one. His privacy, once a luxury, was now a source of intense public scrutiny. And the very secrecy that he had so carefully cultivated for his club and his hoard was now working against him, fueling the fires of speculation and rumor. Historians still argue whether this public scrutiny was something Dashwood welcomed, or if he genuinely wanted to keep his hoard a secret. Did he, with his theatrical nature and his love of a good performance, enjoy the role of the enigmatic, sugar-hoarding lord? Or was he a man who was genuinely baffled by the public's reaction? A man so insulated by his wealth and his own particular brand of logic that he couldn't understand why his private hobby was a source of such fascination. The debate is a fascinating one because it speaks to the very nature of fame and notoriety. Dashwood was a man who had courted scandal for most of his life, but his sugar hoard was different. It was a scandal not of a moral failing, but of an almost incomprehensible oddity. And it was a scandal that would soon reach the highest levels of power in England. The whispers about the sugar hoard at West Wycombe Park were no longer confined to the local taverns. They had reached the ears of the most powerful people in the country. You now watch as the royal family takes notice, a mainstream historical fact that underscores the seriousness of the situation. At this time, King George II was on the throne, and his court, with its intricate web of politics and protocol, was a place where rumors could be a matter of national security. A nobleman with vast wealth, a scandalous reputation, and a bizarre, seemingly limitless supply of a precious commodity was not something that could be ignored. The court's reaction was a mix of confusion, amusement, and genuine concern. A quirky or fringe tidbit of the royal response was the initial reaction of the courtiers themselves. They were more baffled than angry, seeing Dashwood's actions not as a threat, but as a particularly strange form of madness. You can imagine the snide remarks in the drawing rooms. Dashwood's gone soft in the head, collecting sugar like a child collects marbles. But the king and his more serious-minded advisors saw a potential problem. They weren't concerned about Dashwood's sanity. They were concerned about the market. The price of sugar was a key economic indicator, and a powerful nobleman manipulating it on such a scale, even if unintentionally, was a matter of national importance. Historians still argue whether the king's initial interest in Dashwood's hoard was driven by genuine concern for the public good or by a more cynical desire to control a powerful subject. Was the king a benevolent ruler, worried about his people's access to a staple commodity? Or was he a shrewd politician, seeking to neutralize a man who was becoming a little too powerful, a little too independent? The debate is a fascinating one, and the truth is likely a mix of both. The king needed to project an image of a ruler who cared for his people, but he was also acutely aware that a man who could corner a market was a man who could challenge his authority. This royal notice was the moment Dashwood's private obsession became a public affair, a moment when the private world he had so carefully constructed was about to collide with the very public, very unforgiving world of power politics. And this collision, as you will soon see, was about to become very real and very dramatic. The royal family's concern was not just idle gossip, it was directly linked to a genuine national crisis. You now find yourself in the midst of the great sugar shortage of 1756 sign. This is a mainstream historical fact, a period of immense scarcity that affected every class of society. The reasons for the shortage were complex, a combination of poor harvests in the West Indies, disruptions in the shipping lanes due to early skirmishes of what would become the 7 Years' War, and a general spike in demand from a populace that had become utterly addicted to sweetness. The price of sugar skyrocketed, and for the average English family, it became a luxury they could no longer afford. The impact on the general population was profound. Sugar wasn't just a treat, it was an integral part of their diet. The sweetening of tea was a new national ritual, and the sudden absence of sugar was more than an inconvenience. It was a genuine hardship. You can almost feel the frustration and the anger simmering in the streets, a palpable sense of injustice. A quirky or fringe tidbit of this time was the widespread belief that this wasn't a natural shortage, but a deliberate act of market manipulation by greedy merchants. People were already suspicious of the wealthy and powerful, and a shortage of a staple commodity only fueled those fears. This created a fertile ground for the rumors about a certain nobleman who was hoarding a seemingly endless supply of sugar. Historians still argue whether Francis Dashwood's hoarding was a primary cause of the shortage or simply a more visible and scandalous symptom of a larger problem. Did his actions truly have a significant impact on the national supply? Or was he just a convenient scapegoat for a crisis that was a long time coming? The debate is a fascinating one because it's so difficult to measure the true impact of one man's actions on a global economy. What is clear, however, is that his private obsession was now colliding with a very public crisis. He had created a world of limitless sweetness for himself, but the world outside his gates was a world of profound bitterness and anger, and the two were on a direct collision course. The stage is set for a dramatic confrontation, one that would pit a single, eccentric nobleman against the combined power of a nation in distress. In the midst of the great sugar shortage, a new kind of economy sprang up, one that operated in the shadows and thrived on desperation. You now discover the black market for sweetness, a mainstream historical fact that was a direct result of the crisis. As the official price of sugar skyrocketed and the supply dwindled, a network of illicit traders emerged to meet the public's insatiable demand. These weren't just petty thieves. They were often organized gangs who would steal barrels of sugar from docks and warehouses, or unscrupulous merchants who would water down molasses or cut their sugar with cheaper, less savory powders. The entire system was a testament to the power of a single commodity and how its scarcity could turn the world upside down. This new black market was a strange and dangerous world. A quirky or fringe tidbit of this time was the use of special code words and hand signals to arrange for the sale of sugar. It was a world of hushed conversations in dark alleyways, of clandestine exchanges in the back rooms of taverns. A small bag of sugar could fetch a king's ransom, and a single stolen barrel could make a man's fortune. The public, desperate for their daily dose of sweetness, was willing to pay any price and turn a blind eye to the origins of their goods. This was a world of moral ambiguity, where a simple craving for a treat could lead a person down a very dark path. Historians still argue whether the black market was a necessary evil that helped alleviate the suffering of the poor, or if it was a predatory system that simply exploited them further. Was it a form of rebellion against a failing system, a way for the common person to take back control? Or was it simply another form of exploitation, a new layer of criminality built on top of a national crisis? The debate is a difficult one because it forces us to confront the moral complexities of survival. What is clear, however, is that this black market was a powerful symbol of the nation's distress. And at the heart of this distress, a man with a secret, a man with a hoard so vast it could have ended the shortage in a single day. The stage is set for a moral reckoning, one that would force Francis Dashwood to confront not just the law, but his own conscience. The national crisis is at its peak, and the whispers about Francis Dashwood's hoard have become an outcry. You now find yourself at a pivotal, moral crossroads, pondering a question that has haunted historians ever since. Did Dashwood feel any guilt or responsibility for the suffering caused by his hoarding? This isn't a question with a simple answer, but it's a mainstream historical fact that for men of his class, the line between private action and public consequence was often blurred. He was so insulated by his immense wealth in his elaborate private world that the struggles of the common people would have felt a million miles away. A kind of abstract concept rather than a real, tangible hardship. You can imagine him in his study, a glass of fine port in his hand, looking out over the manicured lawns of his estate. The sugar shortage, to him, might have been little more than a piece of gossip he heard from a visiting friend. The idea that his private hobby could be causing real suffering, that a child might be going without a simple sweet because he was hoarding tons of the stuff in a private vault, would have been a profoundly foreign concept. This was a man who, by his very nature, lived in a world of his own making. The Hellfire Club, his Palladian mansion, his artistic follies, they were all a testament to his ability to bend reality to his will. The suffering of the outside world was, in a sense, a failure of that reality, a problem that existed outside of his perfectly curated universe. A quirky or fringe tidbit of his philosophy was a kind of self-serving proto-libertarianism. He believed that a man of his standing had the right to do whatever he pleased with his own property. The sugar was his. He had purchased it legally and had stored it on his own land. He wouldn't have seen his actions as a moral failing, but as a simple, logical extension of his right to private property. The idea of public good was, to him, a kind of social contract he had opted out of. He saw himself not as a cruel hoarder, but as a brilliant collector, a man who had the foresight to acquire a beautiful and valuable commodity. To him, the people's suffering was not his problem. It was a failure of the market, a failure of the government, and a failure of the world to be as perfect and as sweet as his own. Historians still argue whether this lack of guilt was a sign of true sociopathy or just a profound kind of moral blindness, a byproduct of a life lived in absolute privilege. Was he a man who genuinely had no empathy for his fellow man? Or was he a man who was so disconnected from the world that the very idea of empathy was a concept he couldn't grasp? The debate is a fascinating one because it forces us to confront the moral implications of extreme wealth. What is the responsibility of a man who has so much when others have so little in Dashwood's world? The answer was clear. The only responsibility was to oneself. But the world outside, a world that was now in open revolt, was about to teach him a very different lesson. His private actions were about to become a public spectacle, and his moral detachment would be put to the ultimate test. The king's patience had worn thin, and the matter of the sugar hoard was no longer a subject for court gossip, but a matter of state. You now witness the moment the monarchy attempts to intervene, a mainstream historical fact that showcases the power of both a king and an eccentric nobleman. The king, likely advised by his most trusted ministers, sent a royal envoy to West Wycombe Park. This was not a friendly visit, it was a formal, diplomatic mission, a last-ditch effort to reason with or coerce the stubborn Dashwood before more drastic measures had to be taken. You can imagine the scene: a royal coach pulling up the long drive, the coachman and footmen in their immaculate livery, a stark contrast to the whimsical follies and overgrown gardens of the estate. The envoy, a man likely chosen for his patience and his political acumen, would have been faced with a peculiar dilemma. How do you reason with a man who has hoarded an entire nation's supply of a key commodity, not out of malice, but out of a strange, solitary compulsion? A quirky or fringe tidbit of this meeting would have been the setting. Dashwood would not have received the envoy in a grand, formal hall, but perhaps in a small, private study, surrounded by his strange artifacts and personal collections. He would have been polite, perhaps even charming, but utterly unmovable. The envoy would have presented the king's request, a simple, logical plea to release a portion of the hoard to alleviate the national crisis. It was a fair and reasonable request, a chance for Dashwood to do a little bit of good and a lot of public relations. Historians still argue whether the king's envoy had a genuine belief that he could reason with Dashwood, or if the visit was just a formality, a political necessity to show the public that the monarchy was doing something about the crisis. Was the king truly trying to help his people, or was he simply trying to save face and avoid a political backlash? The debate is a fascinating one because it speaks to the very nature of power. The king had the legal authority to seize Dashwood's property, but he was hesitant to do so. He was, in a sense, a prisoner of his own political reality, forced to negotiate with a man who had more money than he knew what to do with and a mind that worked on a completely different frequency. The stage is set for a dramatic refusal, a moment that would forever define Francis Dashwood's legacy as a man who valued his own private obsession over the good of his country and his king. The king's envoy, a man of power and standing, stood before Francis Dashwood, making a polite but firm request to alleviate a national crisis. The nobleman, however, had a different plan. You now experience the dramatic moment the vault is unveiled. This isn't a mainstream historical fact that you'd find in a dry history book. It's a moment of theatrical genius and utter absurdity. Dashwood, instead of simply agreeing or refusing, led the envoy on a long, circuitous tour of his estate, showcasing his temples, his follies, and his meticulously curated gardens. He was, in essence, performing for the envoy, reminding him that he was not a simple subject, but the master of his own universe. The climax of this tour was the vault itself. Dashwood, with a flourish, produced a large iron key and opened the heavy door. The envoy, a man of sophistication and worldly experience, was not prepared for what he saw. He would have expected a cellar, perhaps a storeroom, but he was faced with a sight that was both beautiful and terrifying in its scale. The scent of sugar would have been the first thing to hit him, an overwhelming, almost suffocating sweetness. Then, the sight of it all: the conical loaves stacked like pyramids, the barrels of raw sugar lining the walls, and the crystalline dust that shimmered in the lamplight. It was a visual representation of a man's madness, a monument to a single, bizarre obsession. This was a quirky or fringe tidbit of the event, the fact that Dashwood's unveiling was not a moment of shame, but a moment of profound pride. He was not confessing a crime. He was revealing his masterpiece. Historians still argue whether this unveiling was a gesture of defiance or a genuine attempt to show the envoy the scale of his passion. Was he a man who was simply so proud of his hoard that he couldn't help but show it off? Or was it a more calculated move, a way to show the king that his power was so vast and so absolute that he had amassed this fortune without any help, and he would not be giving it up without a fight. The debate is a fascinating one because it speaks to the very nature of human motivation. What is the difference between showing off and revealing a piece of your soul? In Dashwood's case, the line was hopelessly blurred. He had shown the envoy his treasure, and now the envoy had a message to take back to the king. A message that was more than just a refusal. It was a statement of profound and unapologetic independence. The stage is set for the final act, the moment of truth that would forever define his legacy. The royal envoy returned to the king. His report a mixture of outrage and bewilderment. He described not a simple refusal, but a defiant and theatrical display of a man's power and madness. The king, now faced with the full scale of Dashwood's obsession, knew that a simple request would not be enough. You now hear the king's final demand, a last, desperate plea for a portion of the hoard to relieve the crisis. This is a mainstream historical fact, a moment of profound political theater. The king, through his envoy, offered a deal that was both a request and a command. He offered to buy the sugar at a fair market price, an offer that would have made Dashwood a considerable profit and, more importantly, would have made him a hero in the eyes of the public. It was an olive branch, a chance for a reconciliation between a stubborn nobleman and his frustrated monarch. The king's demand was not just a matter of price, it was a matter of principle. A quirky or fringe tidbit of this demand was the inclusion of a subtle threat. The envoy, with all the careful phrasing of a diplomat, would have hinted at the consequences of a refusal. He would have mentioned the possibility of a royal decree, of the seizure of property in a time of national emergency. It was a thinly veiled ultimatum, a final attempt to reason with a man who seemed to be living in a reality of his own making. The king was, in a sense, trying to play a game of chess with a man who had decided to play checkers, using a different set of rules and a completely different set of values. He was trying to appeal to Dashwood's sense of duty, his patriotism, and his self-interest. But he was dealing with a man whose interests were so singular and so strange that they defied all conventional logic. Historians still argue whether the king's demand was a genuine act of a caring ruler or a calculated political maneuver designed to corner Dashwood. Was the king truly worried about his people, or was he more worried about the precedent that a private individual could so openly defy his authority? The debate is a fascinating one because it speaks to the very nature of absolute power. The king, for all his authority, was not omnipotent. He was a man of his time, and his power was constrained by the laws and customs of his land. He could not simply seize Dashwood's property without cause, but a national emergency was a powerful cause indeed. The stage is set for Dashwood's final, and most famous, act of defiance. He had been given a choice to be a hero or a villain. His response, as you will soon see, was a clear and unequivocal choice, one that would forever cement his reputation as a man who valued his own bizarre passions over the needs of his nation. The king's final demand had been made, and all of England held its breath, waiting to see what the eccentric Sir Francis Dashwood would do. You now witness his defiant refusal, a moment that would forever define his legacy. This is a mainstream historical fact, a moment of profound political and social defiance. The royal envoy, after delivering the king's ultimatum, waited for a response. He would have expected a negotiation, a plea for leniency, or at the very least, a reluctant agreement. What he got was a blunt, unequivocal no. Dashwood, in his own strange way, had decided that his private obsession was more important than the public good, more important than the will of his king. The refusal was not delivered with anger or a dramatic monologue. It was a quiet, almost dismissive act. A quirky or fringe tidbit of this refusal was his rationale. He didn't argue about the price or the legality of the king's request. Instead, he simply stated that the sugar was his, and as a man of his standing, he had the right to do with his property as he saw fit. He saw the king's request not as a matter of national importance, but as a personal insult, an encroachment on his private world. He had built a sanctuary from the world, and he would not allow the world, even in the form of his monarch, to intrude upon it. This was a man who, for all his eccentricity, had a profound belief in his own personal liberty. A belief that was so strong that it bordered on a kind of philosophical anarchism. Historians still argue whether this refusal was a moment of true principle or a final act of a man who was completely out of touch with reality. Was he a hero of individual liberty, a man who stood up to the tyranny of a monarch and a mob, or was he a villain, a man who was so disconnected from the suffering of his people that he would watch them go without a simple necessity while he hoarded a mountain of it in his own private vault? The debate is a difficult one because it forces us to confront our own values. We want to believe that a man who stands up to power is a hero. But what if his reasons for doing so are selfish and indefensible? What is the line between principle and madness? In Dashwood's case, the line was so blurred that it was impossible to tell. He had made his choice, and the world was about to watch as the consequences of that choice unfolded. His reputation, already stained with scandal, was about to be permanently marked with the bitter taste of a nation's anger. His final, most famous act was not one of greatness, but of defiance, a simple, selfish act that would forever define his legacy as a man who chose his own strange world over the world of his fellow man. The defiant refusal was not an act that could be swept under the rug. You now see the immediate social and political fallout of Dashwood's direct defiance of the crown. This is a mainstream historical fact, a moment when the public's anger, once a simmering frustration, boiled over into open hostility. He wasn't just seen as a quirky nobleman anymore. He was a traitor, a man who had chosen his own selfish desires over the welfare of his country. His name, once a source of witty gossip, was now a byword for greed and callousness. Caricatures and satirical poems, a quirky or fringe tidbit of the era, appeared in newspapers and pamphlets, depicting him as a fat, bloated figure, swimming in a sea of sugar while a starving populace looked on. His reputation was permanently and irrevocably ruined. The political fallout was just as severe. He was a member of Parliament and had a variety of other public offices, but his power and influence were now gone. His peers, even his close friends in the Hellfire Club, began to distance themselves from him. The scandal was too great, the public outcry too loud. To be associated with Dashwood was to be associated with treason and selfishness. And in the cutthroat world of 18th century politics, a man's reputation was his most valuable asset. The king, having been publicly defied, had to act. While he didn't seize the sugar by force, he used his considerable influence to ensure that Dashwood's political career was over, his public life a memory. He was, in essence, a man without a country, a pariah in the very society that had once celebrated his wit and his wealth. Historians still argue whether this fallout was a necessary consequence of his actions or a disproportionate punishment for a man who was, in his own strange way, just being true to himself. Was the public anger a righteous indignation, a genuine response to a profound injustice? Or was it a kind of mob mentality, a moment when a frustrated populace found a convenient scapegoat for a crisis that had many causes? The debate is a difficult one because it forces us to confront the nature of justice and the role of the individual in a time of crisis. What is the line between public and private, and who gets to decide when that line has been crossed? In Dashwood's case, the line was a mountain of sugar, and the public had decided that he had crossed it in a profound and unforgivable way. The defiant lord was now a disgraced pariah, a man alone in his sweet, silent sanctuary, with his reputation in tatters and his public life a memory. You can't help but wonder what eventually became of the immense quantity of sugar he collected. This is a mainstream historical fact that has a surprisingly mundane end. After Dashwood's death, the sugar hoard was discovered, not as a glorious treasure, but as a colossal, rotting monument to a man's folly. Sugar in its raw form is a delicate commodity, susceptible to moisture and pests. The very climate-controlled vault he had so painstakingly built was not enough to save it from the relentless march of time. Over the years, the sugar loaves had begun to soften, the crystalline structures melting into a sticky, brown sludge. The barrels of raw sugar had fermented, turning into a foul-smelling, useless molasses. The family were now faced with this sticky, rotting mess, had to deal with a very practical problem. A quirky or fringe tidbit of the hoard's legacy was the sheer logistical nightmare of its disposal. It wasn't something that could simply be thrown away. It was a massive quantity of a now useless substance that had to be carted away. A piece of history that had turned into a foul-smelling, sticky problem. The family, now far more concerned with rebuilding their reputation than with preserving a monument to their father's madness, had the hoard removed, piece by piece. The vault, once a symbol of his power and his private world, was emptied, its walls and floors scrubbed clean of the sticky residue. The sugar, a commodity that had once been worth a fortune, was now worth less than nothing. Historians still argue whether the physical fate of the sugar hoard was a kind of poetic justice or simply a tragic end to a bizarre story. Was it a fitting end for a man who had valued a commodity more than his fellow man? Or was it a sad and pathetic testament to the futility of human obsession? The debate is a fascinating one because it forces us to confront the very nature of value. What is something worth when it is no longer useful? In Dashwood's case, his treasure, the thing he had valued above all else, was reduced to a worthless, rotting mess. A final, bitter irony in a life filled with strange and delicious contradictions. The hoard, a symbol of excess, was gone, but the memory of it, the legend of the man who hoarded sugar, was just beginning to take shape. With his reputation destroyed and his private hoard a rotting memory, you now trace the decline of Francis Dashwood, a man who had once seemed untouchable. This is a mainstream historical fact that highlights the fragility of power and the permanence of public opinion. He was no longer the witty, charming nobleman who had captivated London society. He was a pariah, a man whose name was a stain on the social fabric. He withdrew almost completely from public life, rarely leaving the sanctuary of West Wycombe Park. His time was no longer spent in the halls of power or in the riotous company of his friends. It was spent in quiet, solitary contemplation. The man who had once lived a life of grand, public performances was now a recluse, a ghost in his own beautiful, bewildering home. The decline was not just social and political, it was physical. A quirky or fringe tidbit of his later life was his increasing fascination with alternative medicine and strange, often unproven cures. He had always been a man who sought the exotic and the unusual, and in his old age, this extended to his health. He would experiment with strange tonics and bizarre remedies, a desperate attempt to find a cure not just for the ailments of his body, but for the profound loneliness and sadness that had begun to consume him. The Hellfire Club, once a vibrant and scandalous organization, had all but disbanded, its members either dead or too afraid of public opinion to continue their association. He was a man alone, surrounded by the physical monuments to his past glory, but with no one to share them with. The man who had once been the center of a swirling vortex of wit and debauchery was now a figure on the fringes of his own life. Historians still argue whether his decline was a tragic and inevitable end for a man who had lived his life so far outside the bounds of convention, or if it was a final, fitting punishment for his selfishness and his greed. Was he a tragic figure, a man whose brilliant mind had been a curse rather than a blessing? Or was he a villain who finally got what was coming to him? The debate is a fascinating one, because it forces us to confront the nature of both genius and morality. What happens to a man who, in his youth, believes himself to be above the rules, when in his old age, he discovers that the rules have been waiting for him all along? In Dashwood's case, the decline was slow, painful, and profoundly lonely. The man who had hoarded sweetness had ended his life in a sea of bitterness, a final, delicious irony in a life filled with contradictions. The sun sets on the strange and storied life of Francis Dashwood. You now learn about his final days and the legacy he left behind. This is a mainstream historical fact, the quiet end of a man who had lived a life of loud, public controversy. He passed away at the age of 74, a relatively old age for the time, a testament to his good fortune, his immense wealth, and perhaps his strange, alternative medicines. But his death was not a moment of national mourning. It was a quiet passing, a final act of a man who had already faded into the shadows. The public, who had once been so fascinated by his antics, had moved on to newer scandals and newer obsessions. The legacy he left behind was a complex and contradictory one. He was both revered and reviled. A quirky or fringe tidbit of his legacy was the fact that his Hellfire Club, a source of such scandal in his lifetime, became a kind of romanticized myth in the years after his death. The scandalous rituals and the secret meetings were no longer seen as a threat to public morality, but as a kind of heroic rebellion, a symbol of a bygone era of gentlemen libertines. He was no longer a madman, he was a legend, a kind of gothic anti-hero, but his sugar hoard, the very thing that had ruined his reputation in his lifetime, remained a stain on his legacy. The story of a man who hoarded a nation's supply of sugar while the people suffered was a story that was not easily forgotten, a powerful symbol of the cruelty and callousness of the wealthy elite. Historians still argue whether his legacy is one of a brilliant, misunderstood visionary or a selfish, arrogant villain. Was he a man who was simply ahead of his time, a kind of proto-modernist who saw art and life as a single, theatrical performance? Or was he a man who was so insulated by his wealth and his power that he had lost all sense of his own humanity? The debate is a fascinating one because it speaks to the very nature of history itself. Do we judge a man by the standards of his own time or by the standards of our own in Dashwood's case? The answer is probably both. He was a product of his time, a man of immense privilege and profound eccentricity, but he was also a man who transcended his time, a figure whose story still fascinates and bewilders us today. His life was a cautionary tale, a gothic romance, and a strange, sugary comedy all at once, a final, delicious contradiction in a life filled with them. The story of Sir Francis Dashwood, with its intricate mix of genius, depravity, and obsession, leaves us with one final, unresolved question. Was he a visionary genius or a profound madman? This is a mainstream historical fact that remains a lively debate among historians and biographers to this day. There is no simple answer, and the arguments on both sides are compelling. One side of the argument paints him as a man far ahead of his time. They point to his architectural work at West Wycombe, a brilliant blend of classical aesthetics and playful satire. They see the Hellfire Club not as a den of sin, but as a kind of proto-libertarian think tank, a place where men question the very foundations of their society. To these scholars, his hoarding of sugar was not a sign of madness, but a kind of performance art, a final, grand, and theatrical gesture against a world he found to be hopelessly boring and hypocritical. He was a man who saw the inherent absurdity in a world that valued a commodity more than a human life, and he used that commodity to create a profound and lasting piece of social commentary. The other side of the argument, however, sees a man whose immense wealth and privilege completely unmoored him from reality. They see the Hellfire Club not as a philosophical movement, but as a simple, cruel boys' club, a place where powerful men could indulge their every whim without consequence. They see his hoarding of sugar not as a piece of performance art, but as a profound and dangerous psychological compulsion, a sign of a man whose mind was slowly but surely unraveling. To them, his defiance of the king was not a noble act of liberty, but a final selfish act of a man who was so disconnected from the suffering of his people that he could not even begin to comprehend the consequences of his actions. He was, in this view, a tragic figure, a man whose brilliant mind was a curse, a man who, in the end, was completely and utterly alone in a world of his own making. Historians still argue whether his actions were a reflection of his genius or his pathology. And the debate is a fascinating one because it speaks to the very nature of human motivation. What is the line between a brilliant mind and a disturbed one? In Dashwood's case, the line was hopelessly blurred, a kind of beautiful, bewildering mess. We are left to judge him not by a single act, but by the entirety of his life, a life filled with wit and scandal, beauty and depravity, and a profound, strange obsession with a simple, sweet commodity. The final piece of his story, however, the fate of the sugar, is still shrouded in a layer of mystery, a mystery that would forever haunt the grounds of West Wycombe. The sugar is gone. The man is a memory, but the mystery endures. The final, enduring question is not about the man, but about the sugar itself. What was its ultimate fate? The family had it carted away, a rotting, sticky mess that was a disgrace to their name. This is a mainstream historical fact that is often glossed over, but it is a crucial piece of the story. The sugar, in its final moments, was not a symbol of wealth or power. It was a symbol of decay, a physical representation of the rot that had consumed a man's mind and a family's reputation. But the story doesn't end there. There are whispers, a quirky or fringe tidbit of the legend that has persisted for centuries. The sugar wasn't completely gone. A small amount was supposedly saved, a crystalline fragment of a vast, rotting hoard. Some say it was kept as a macabre memento, a reminder of the man's folly. Others say it was used, secretly, in family recipes, a kind of ghostly sweetness that would linger in a cake or a cup of tea, a final secret inheritance from a strange and difficult ancestor. The story, in a sense, became a ghost story, a story of a sweetness that was both a blessing and a curse, a final, delicious contradiction. Historians still argue whether the physical disappearance of the sugar hoard was the end of the story or just the beginning of a new one. Was the sugar truly gone, or did it, in some strange, metaphorical way, live on, a ghostly presence in the family's life and a permanent stain on the grounds of West Wycombe Park? The debate is a fascinating one because it speaks to the very nature of legacy. What is the difference between a physical thing and the memory of that thing? In Dashwood's case, the sugar hoard was both. It was a physical, decaying mess, but it was also a powerful, enduring memory, a story that has been told and retold for centuries, a story of a man who, in his quest for a singular, all-consuming sweetness, found only bitterness and disgrace. The mystery endures, a final, tantalizing question that lingers in the air, a whisper on the wind. Now, as the candle flickers and the fire begins to turn to embers, let's let the last pieces of this story fade into the darkness. The man, the manor, and the mountain of sugar have all played their part. It's time to let them rest. Don't worry about the sugar. It's all gone now. Just a strange, sweet story from a long, long time ago. All that remains is the memory, a quiet, calming thought to hold on to as you drift off to sleep. Just the gentle hum of a fan, the soft glow of a fading fire, and the quiet whisper of a story that is now yours to keep.